Welcome to The Art of Show, where we feature the people who are creating amazing stories for kids. Join us as we chat with children's book illustrators and authors, storyboardists, animators, and more. Now, their art might be for kids, but aren't we all just kids at heart? Here's your host, Brandon.
What is up, guys? Welcome back to The Art of Show. We are hanging out with an incredible artist this week. You guys are going to enjoy this interview. This was a blast, but before we dive into it, a couple updates. First off, this is the last episode before Christmas, so Merry Christmas. Hope you guys are having a blast with your family, and wanted to let you guys know that we are going to provide you guys a little holiday-themed episode for you this week. So we lined up this guest just for you guys because of that, but before we even get into that, I want to let you guys know, as always, a quick update on my end. I'm working on a new book that involves a boy that is lost in space, and you guys can actually be involved in the process if that interests you at all. And you can check out the book and you can get it for free. It's coming out probably early February. And so you guys can go to Brandon Cullum, CULLUM.com/space. You'll jump on the team that's helping decide what happens next in the book. But let's get to this week. We are talking with Aaron Becker. Aaron is amazing. His books, if you guys aren't readers, you're going to really like his books because they're actually wordless picture books. And so what does that mean? I mean, it means there are literally no words in any three of his books. And so he's got a trilogy called the Journey Trilogy that just wrapped up this year with Return. So it's Journey, Quest, and Return. A really cool just journey into imagination. It's got a Narnia feel. So you kind of start in the real world, and then this little girl escapes and gives on these amazing adventures. It's an amazing trilogy. So we talked about Quest a good bit, but really we talked about his whole process. And then he works on these massive watercolors, huge paintings. They take forever. They're super elaborate, and they're just gorgeous. So these are a ton of fun to read, and just to hear his process is really cool too. Aaron, we mentioned, it's a little bit holiday themed, and so he actually did some visual development on Polar Express. So if you guys have seen that movie, especially around this time of year, I'm sure it might be popping up. But he was actually in movies and film beforehand, and so he comes from that background, but then he's applying it to books. And another real interesting part of this interview is he talks about how location really influenced him. And so I think all three of these books, his first three books, he was actually in a different location. And so Return, he was actually in Spain. And you can see some of that influence of the architecture and the castles and stuff that he has designed in the book. So we're going to dive into our interview with Aaron Becker, and hope you guys are having a great holiday season. And until next week, we'll talk to you soon. Well, we want to welcome you guys back to The Art of Show. We're hanging out with Mr. Aaron Becker today, who is an amazing illustrator, has the third in his three-part trilogy. Do you call it the Journey Trilogy? Is that?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Journey, Quest, and Return just came out in August. Is that right?
Yeah, August. Mm-hmm.
And we're talking a little bit before we went live, where I was reading back through them, but I guess I wasn't really reading because they're wordless books, and the illustrations are amazing, and so you could get lost in them. But thanks for hanging out with us and joining the show.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, we love to dive into kind of your art background a little bit, as well as not only just the books. And I was reading through your bio, and you wanted to be an astronaut. Is that right, growing up?
Yeah, that was actually, I guess it's not Georgia. I went to space camp in Alabama.
Yeah, in Huntsville.
Yeah. When I was in like fifth grade.
Okay.
And my mom was an astronomy teacher in the college level. So we used to go to like her big observatory at the college and look out at planets and stars and stuff like that. But certainly like just the excitement around outer space travel at that point in time was, I think, much higher than it is for kids today.
Yeah, because you were growing up on the tail end of Apollo. Is that right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So that was,
and also when I was coming of age, like the space shuttle was just starting too. Mm-hmm. So it was like, whoa, there's people going out into space in this cool ship, and that was definitely I mean, I think that was just sort of my adventurous personality. but I am not built for, anything closely related to military training or becoming a pilot and all that. Like I can't even wake up in the morning, let alone, clean my room. So
Yeah. I actually went to school for aerospace engineering because I wanted to be an astronaut. And then I got deep into like the math and science classes. I'm like, there's no way I can't do this the rest of my life. So,
Oh, interesting. Yeah, there's always another side to these pursuits.
yeah, there definitely is.
One of my biggest art heroes did Ralph McQuarrie, who I'm sure you know, like the concept designer for the old Star Wars movies. He was a aerospace illustrator.
Really? That's cool.
So he got his start working for Boeing and like NASA and stuff, doing these really awesome concept ideas of what space travel might be like, and I think it's interesting how these things all kind of intersect.
Yeah, they definitely do. And so I was listening to an interview with you earlier, and I think you were showing a dummy you had done. Was it in eighth grade, kind of your first kids book? So even though you didn't go to college straight for kids books, were kids books kind of always part of your story growing up and wanting to create them?
I was always into drawing.
Okay.
And like sticking the story together and stapling some paper together was a pretty easy way to do it. But I think I was less interested in story than I was in imagery.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the my earliest book projects were all like how to draw books,
okay,
based on like Ed Emberley's books.
Okay, yeah.
And so I would just like do like how to draw knights, how to draw, UFOs, and I would just come up with my own little Ed Emberley style diagrams and stuff. I was definitely more on like the math spectrum of art than I was on the I don't know, exploratory free-spirited side. I was kind of wanting to understand the world.
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out like what is life about? How do I exist? How do I make sense of anything? And to me, paper was a way, and drawing was a way to organize what I was seeing outside of myself and kind of approach the world tentatively through that lens.
What were some of your favorite things to draw growing up?
Oh, I think just typical kid stuff, spaceships blowing up and,
yes.
Aliens and pirates and you name it, mermaids and anything sort of on the fantasy realm for
Gotcha.
sure.
That's cool. So now you didn't major in art in college in 4 years, is that right?
Right. Yeah. When I finished up high school, I hadn't really done much art.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I had sort of played around with doing some illustration work for the new school newspaper in high school.
Okay.
I got an internship with an illustrator in Baltimore where I grew up. But I wasn't thinking seriously that you could make a living doing art. It hadn't really crossed my mind. And I also wasn't, in Baltimore, there was a high school called the School for the Arts.
Okay.
And it was a public school, and you could just apply to it in fine arts, music, whatever you want. And it never even crossed my mind in eighth grade to go to a high school just for the arts, because to me that was the kids who are a little bit more counterculture or more wandering at that point. And I was doing sports, and I was into academics, and I the idea of hanging out and smoking and doing dark, moody pictures was just not my thing.
Yeah.
As you can probably tell from Journey and the kind of work that I ended up doing.
Yeah.
So then I applied to a regular college. It wasn't on my radar. And I got into graphic design after college because of the .com explosion. It was pretty easy to get work doing that if you were young and had any design sense at all. And after the .com crash, I was if I want to do this, I actually have to hustle. And that's when I realized I don't love this enough to put in the sweat that's required. At that point, I was probably about 27.
Okay.
And I went to this school in Pasadena called the Art Center, which is basically a funnel for the automotive industry, for fashion design, for photography, and for film. And I wanted to do film. I wanted to do I wasn't sure. I'm not sure children's book. It was sort of on my radar at that point, but I was more interested in just doing cool stuff and learning how to finally draw get form and understand shadow and composition, and like all of my drawings at that point were very flat and not very dynamic. So that was that decision, and interestingly enough, like I got there and I hated it. So
You hated college?
I hated art center.
Or art center, gotcha. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, college was great.
Okay,
But, yeah, and a lot of I know you've talked to Dan.
Yeah.
Santat, and he went there, and a lot of Peter Brown went there. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, he definitely went there. So there's like a school of illustrators who came out of that program and got a lot out of it. But for me, I was like, I kind of went in there a little bit late. I was one of the older students at that time, and I was like, what am I doing here?
Right.
Like, I got in and got out. Like in 2 semesters, I learned the fundamentals of getting to like draw what's in my head.
Right. Right.
I didn't have my own style. I didn't have like a portfolio. I didn't have like those advanced classes that you might take that would sort of hone what you're aiming for. I didn't have that, but I did have the foundation, and luckily for me, you know, it just all worked out. I didn't need to spend another 6 semesters like through it probably would have changed my trajectory entirely. You know?
Yeah, because you were heading towards movies. Is that right? Was that the direction that you wanted to go towards?
Yeah, I think I was heading towards entertainment design.
Okay.
And that's what I ended up doing. So like I was at school the last week of classes when I had already decided to drop out and go back to doing graphic design. I don't know what I was going to do, but I just couldn't justify the expense of school. I was paying out of pocket. It was like extremely expensive, and plus I wasn't feeling it. You know, I wasn't in it enough, and I went back to school to drop off a project, and this guy from Lucasfilm was there giving a presentation, and I went to the presentation, but it wasn't really. I was like, I don't know if I want to do this. You know, I'm out of here. That was my attitude at the time. But I saw him leaving the school as I was like on my bicycle biking up the hill to Art Center. It's on the top of this hill, and I lived at the bottom, and I'm like biking up. I see him. I'm like, screw it. I might as well go talk to the guy.
Yeah.
It turns out that he's like a bike aficionado, a bicycle aficionado, and motorcycle. But I had my you know, junky bicycle that I had ridden up the hill, but I had like torn all the stickers off of it for some reason and kind of done some custom paint work on it. And he thought it was a pretty cool bike. And so we just start chatting about bikes. And by the end of the conversation, he's like, oh, well, you know, I'm going to work for Doug Chiang right now on Polar Express. And Doug Chiang is the art director for the prequels of Star Wars, as well as now he's a vice president at Lucasfilm. And so I'm like, what? Are you kidding me?
That's cool.
Yeah. And so he's like, send me your stuff. And so I moved up to the Bay Area where Doug had his operation. And every week I would bike with this guy I had met. His name's Kurt Kaufman. He's a concept illustrator. And we'd go on a bike ride. And then after the bike ride, I'd come into the office and give Doug a new painting. And Doug at first was just like humoring me. He's like, you know, because my stuff wasn't that good. Like I hadn't done much.
Yeah.
I had actually not finished an illustration at Art Center. All I had done was draw faces and hands and
yeah.
and so I'm like I just kept going, and at some point I think Doug really valued loyalty and a sense of conviction and whatever. And I got this call. I swear it was like 3 months of this. 3 months every week going in with a new painting, and Doug would say, keep going. I don't have anything for you right now. We don't have a budget to bring anybody on. I was like, I'll work for free. I'll intern, man. It doesn't matter. He's like, well, I want to pay you. So I get this phone call like just before Christmas. He's like, I got a job for you. What's your salary requirement?
You're like, what? Yeah, that's so cool.
And I did that for like almost 10 years before Journey. So that was my education, to be honest, was working in a studio with extremely talented people.
Yeah.
I mean, I was like sharing desks with these guys that are like my heroes, you know, and insanely good draftsmen, painters, storytellers, really nice guys. And they taught me, you know, and Doug taught me just by kind of giving me art direction, really. And so by the time that journey was over, I had the skills to tell my own story, do my own book, and it all fell into place.
So you've got, sounds like a great job working on movies, doing things that you love. Why did you go back? How did kids' books even come into that conversation?
Right. Well, that's a really good question because it was something I enjoyed doing. My situation had changed a bit. So I'd always wanted to get into Pixar, was sort of like my end game. And Disney at some point bought our studio, which was Robert Zemeckis' studio. So we were all under one big umbrella, and they had a policy that you shouldn't really go and try and get work at another studio, and they certainly shouldn't try and headhunt you. And so I was applying to jobs at Pixar, but not getting anywhere. And at some point, I was like, "Screw this!" I wasn't really big on the motion capture films we were doing. There was something like kind of more video gamey about that world, and the guys who were thriving in it were more into machines and robots and dragons, and I was kind of like more into Pixar and happy, fluffy things. And I mean, that's the simplified way of doing it, but I really like their films, to be honest. There's like their storytelling is fantastic, and they've got an insane talent pool. And so that's where I wanted to head, and it wasn't working out. And I, at some point, I just decided, okay, I'm not gonna, it's not gonna work out. And we moved back east. I was working remotely for Doug at that point. I swear to God, the day we made an offer on our house here in Amherst, I got a call from Pixar.
Are you serious?
We've got a matte painting position. Do you want to interview for it? I went out. I interviewed for it. They called me back. They're like, "So, here's the deal. Are you willing to move back?" I was like, can I just work remotely? Is there any way that's possible? But they wanted me to move there, and I had to turn it down. And it's a good thing I did.
So what were you doing once you had moved back east at this time?
I was still working for Doug for Zemeckis' studio. Disney shut that down. Like within 2 years of us moving here, it was done. Like 400 people got laid off overnight. It was a disaster. And it was actually between my layoff and working on Journey that I got the Pixar job. So not only I had nowhere to go, and I had this like dream job fall in my lap, and I still said no. And it reminds me of something that I listened to your podcast with Dan, who I know. Yeah. And he had this similar situation with Google, right? And you have these moments in life where you have this thing fall in your lap and you could do it, and it's safe and it's like secure and it's kind of what you want. It would provide certain things for your family. And our daughter had just been born. We'd bought a house. We'd bought a new car. I'd just lost my job. And I had already started working on Journey at that point. And I had seen the potential of being your own storyteller. Like everything's in your lap. You are the set designer. You are the director. You are the actor. You're the screenwriter. It's really empowering. And because of that, and I was working at my own home studio and not having to do a commute and not having to deal with like the BS of office politics and all that kind of stuff. So I had this offer from Pixar, and I was like, oh man, that's what I've wanted for a long time.
Yeah.
And I just had to say no, and I kept working on Journey, and I'm really glad I made that decision, because there's sort of there's a give and take. So when you're doing your own thing and not having the comfort of like a studio to support your sense of well-being, to support your community, to support your growth as an artist, it's kind of all on your shoulders. You have to figure out the next project. You have to make sure the money's going to come in to support your family, et cetera. But I guess I would trade that for the security, because a lot of guys that I worked with, they'd always talk about, hey, let's do a personal project and let's have a meeting and talk about some like thing we want to do on the side. Let's put a book together of our like illustrations that we do after hours. And it was like a reaction to like sitting at a desk all day and working for somebody else, Yeah. And I think it's important for your listeners who are interested in getting into entertainment design and doing working for a video game company or a film company. Like there's a definite allure to it. no doubt. That you get to say, hey, I'm working for Pixar,
Right.
But at the end of the day, I know a lot of guys who have left there to do their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
Once you sort of have a little bit of clout or stability or ability, something allows you to take that leap. And I guess I would recommend doing that if and when you have the opportunity. And that said, it's easy for me to say because it worked out for me. And also, I had 10 years behind me of doing all that.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't like I said no at the beginning to Doug. I was
Right.
like, no, I don't need a job from you. I'm going to go do my own books.
Right.
I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had to learn. I had to learn the hard way. And then like the only way. It's just how it is.
Yeah, it's funny because I had Noah Classic, who did Cloud Country on the podcast, who is an art director at Pixar. But I think he said almost what you said. He's like, it's like it's super creative, but I wanted to create my own stories, and so I had to do that outside of the studio. Okay, so I didn't realize your journey to Journey was as interesting as Journey. So that came out in 2013. Is that right?
Right.
Journey. Okay. So what was it like getting, I can imagine having to pitch, because this was your first book. Is that right?
Right.
So what was that process like of getting it published, working with a publisher, trying to convince them of an idea? Because it's very unlike anything else that's out there. I'd say at least currently. And it's amazing. What was that process like, just getting into that world?
Right. Because of my film background, I had a pretty solid looking portfolio of illustration work that was all film based, but I did a lot of children's films,
right.
And so at that point I was like, I've got to get an agent. It's called a literary agent, and a literary agent is someone who knows the editors and the publishers really well. In fact, it's a very small world. Like there's a handful of not a handful, but there's like a room full of people who are the shakers and movers of children's books.
Mm-hmm.
And from when you're not in that world, it seems like, oh, it's this huge thing, and how am I going to get into it? But you realize once you're in it, you realize it's a super small, intimate world, and everybody knows each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a bit foolhardy to think, I'm just going to write off to these editors as an unsolicited artist with I've got the whole thing worked out. I got my book, I got the story, it looks great, and they're going to want to publish it. And I kind of had the sense that after having hustled as a freelancer, it's hard to get people to notice, even when you've got like a resume, even when you got contacts, it's hard to get work. So I went with an agent, and the agent, she knew right away. She's like, well, this is the houses we should send it to. These are the editors who I think are looking for this kind of stuff. And sure enough, we sent it out to, I built a dummy, and I spent a long time on it. It was like, it wasn't just like a PDF, which at the time wasn't normal anyway, but it wasn't a printout or whatever. I like hand bound this cardboard, thing. I sewed the pages together. I figured out how to do end papers.
That's cool.
And I like glued linen on the cloth. Like I wanted it to look primo because And that was something at Art Center that they're big on understanding how to present yourself professionally. Goes a long, long way, because so many people, especially in this day of Twitter, it's like or younger people think like it's really casual. You can just call people by their first name and show up, and I'm sounding like a grumpy old man, but in some ways it's really true. Like, it's amazing. Sometimes students contact me, and they're like, hey, can you do this for me? Or like, I have some assignment, and I'm like, no, that's not how it works.
Right.
The only way to succeed is to like take those extra steps. So that's what I did. I got this really nice looking thing together. I made 3 copies. We sent 3 out. We sent 5 out. 2 were just like two were PDFs, and 3 were like my top picks for publishers. And we got, from those 5 submissions, we got 2 offers. And that's how I got in the door with Journey. And they weren't looking at like final artwork. They were looking at these really sketchy things. It wasn't really polished. But I think the story was pretty solid at that point, and they could see my my website of, that they knew I could aim. They knew that the final product wasn't going to look like a sketch.
Yeah. That's so cool. I actually had Jen Ely, who's a visual development artist. She's done some stuff with Leica, and when she went to SCAD, and she developed almost like a wooden box with her portfolio that she gave to Leica because they do all the stop motion, like the physical things. And she said that was the key, just how she presented it. So
absolutely,
it's so cool.
Yeah, good for her. It's like so important, and it's so amazing how few people think to do that.
Yeah,
and not just in like it's not just like in your career. It's like everything.
Yeah.
If you can turn that switch on, like you're doing this podcast and reaching out to people that you are interested in talking to, like how many people are out there who are like, oh, I want to do a picture book and aren't bothering to do that kind of.
Yeah.
It's really interesting,
Yeah. So I definitely want to get into the books. When you started on Journey, did you have the 3-part book kind of in your mind, like the fact that it's going to be 3 books coming out,
right?
And how did you keep track of the story since it's not written, or did you write out the story? Like how did that kind of work, your process?
I think for each book I had like a 1-page Word document that was like bullet points, like girl arrives, frees bird, gets captured.
Yeah.
Like that was just to kind of like get that part of my brain out of the way. And then I do storyboards. And in fact, when I storyboarded Journey before I this is like before I had a contract, like before it existed, all it was like a drawing of a castle with this girl on a boat, and that was it. And I was like, all right, I got to write a book. And so what I did was I did storyboards of about a 40-page picture book. My aim was like where the wild things are. I looked at where the wild things are. It's 40 pages. Okay, I'm doing a 40-page book.
Yeah.
And I finished the drawings, which were a little different than the final book, but not that different. And then I went back to add what the dialogue or what the narration would be, and it seemed so redundant. Like, what can I add to this? The story's being told visually, and I had no intention of doing a wordless picture book. It really just like happened, and then I was like, all right, I guess I'm doing a wordless picture book. At that point, I did not have the whole trilogy mapped out, but I had this element of the story that was really frustrating that I hadn't dealt with, which is the girl's relationship to her family. So in the story, if you're not familiar with Journey, this girl has this magic crayon that gets her into this Narnia type world, and she goes on these adventures, and she's sort of propelled to go to Narnia because her family's boring.
Yeah.
And she has nothing to do at home, and so she uses her imagination. But in Journey, it's resolved because she makes a friend in Narnia, in this other realm. But there's no healing of the rift between her and her family. And if Journey could have been a longer book, I would have dealt with it in one book. But then when the publisher started to get excited about the book, and I realized, hey, they're going to put something behind this, and it's not just going to like appear on a shelf and go away, I thought, hey, I could expand this story.
Yeah.
And at that point, my agent and I went into Candlewick Press, who's the publisher, and we pitched the whole trilogy, the second and the third Quest and Return. And at that point, they were like pretty solid concepts of what the story was going to be. And this was before Journey was published. So I'd actually finished they were totally on board. I had finished the artwork for Quest before Journey even published, because there's always this like lag, like you finish the artwork and then it takes 1.5 years for the book to come out. So it was, in some ways, it was all planned out ahead of time.
Okay.
But when I first started to work on Journey, my thing was like, I want to do a picture book. I've always wanted to do a picture book. Wouldn't it be great to get published?
Yeah, that's so cool. So I had to ask in Return, in the cave with the hieroglyphics. That was such a cool idea, because I was thinking, it's like, I wonder if you ever did like storyboards or anything. I'm like, wait a minute, here are all the storyboards of like the other books are like inside of the cave. Yeah, right. How did that come about, that element?
I had a different ending to the story where they have this big kind of climactic battle on the top of this city that was in the middle of the ocean. And it was sort of like, I found these like really interesting limestone cliffs in England. And I based it off of that and like built this kind of fishing village on top of these towers. And so it was this really romantic, beautiful, awesome, kick-ass environment that I was pretty excited to use.
Yeah.
I came up with this story where the emperor and the king and all the characters are sort of like it's all coming to a head. and it just wasn't working. Like there wasn't an emotional tug to it. I mean, the dad was there, and they were still like, it was still the same general story of like the girl being met and play with her dad, and how and they go home and all's well. Like he finally joins her. So the story wasn't working, and then I sat back and I was like, wait a minute, like what if instead of there being this big thing on top of this tower of these cliff sides, what if they have to go down into the belly of the beast, like the traditional mythology stuff?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
what if there's some clue that they're a part of this universe? I think that's how it started. And then I was like, oh, bam, this story, the dad gets the idea for what he's going to draw from the prophecy
That's cool.
on the petroglyphs. And so, yeah, that's how that. And I actually, this is interesting. I worked with an intern that summer. I was like, we were getting ready to travel to Spain for the year where I was going to do the paintings. And my wife had lost her job. We had like another year of preschool to pay for. We're like, screw it. Let's rent our house. Let's go to Spain. No healthcare costs, no preschool costs there.
Yeah,
It's all
yeah.
public education. So we went there, and I brought all my paintings, but I was like, there was like a hectic time, and I had to have everything ready to go. So I was working with this intern, and I was like, okay, here's the story. Here's the backstory of the trilogy. Can you make a petroglyph that tells the story?
Yeah.
So she actually designed that. I would like definitely gave her a lot of input.
Yeah.
But that was her drawings. And what was neat about that was that when I went to kind of include them into that illustration, they looked like they had sort of been done by someone else. Like they had a different kind of fluidity to them. And I thought that was really an interesting way to like that these drawings were done, hundreds of years ago by some civilization that was prophesizing these set of events.
Yeah. Yeah. As we're kind of wrapping up, one question I wanted to ask specific to the design is all of the illustrations felt like they're very much in a place, like very much a different world. And I know you've written a couple great blog posts that I'll link in the show notes, and you just mentioned Spain, and it almost felt like you would move to a different location for a different project. And so you had very much like a real sense of like this, even though this is a crazy thing in the sky, like this is a real thing. Where did that come from? Has that always been kind of part of your style, just the whole world building and a very much sense of place in your illustrations?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I think some authors and storytellers start with character.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty natural place to start. Like, what is the dilemma of your protagonist? What's going to be their hero's journey or whatever it is? And I just don't, my brain just doesn't work that way. It always feels very contrived. If I try and construct a story based on like the principles of storytelling, it's just like, I'm like, there's no point in doing this. It's been done before.
Yeah.
So I need to kind of move into story a little bit more abstractly, and I do that through space. So like I said earlier, like the Journey trilogy began as a big pencil drawing of a castle. Mm-hmm. I just sat down one day or over a couple of days, and I drew this really complex, detailed image of a castle and this boat kind of heading towards the front gate through a river. I didn't have any story at all. So to me, unless I know where I am, unless I have a really strong sense of place, I can't build the emotion. I can't build the stories. And I think that in entertainment design is a good example. Is like everything's really divided up in terms of your skill set, right? Mm-hmm. So there's people who just do character design. There's people who are, or at Leica, there's people who just design like the little flower pots in the back. And there's people who design the clothing, and there's people who design the sets, and there's people who are in charge of story. That's all they do is story. And I think it's really natural to have your way in to story. And my way in is through environment. I was always more interested in environment than characters when I worked in film. And so to me, like actually doing Journey was sort of like an excuse to draw a bunch of environments. And then I was like, okay, if I want to do these cool paintings of a castle and a forest and whatever else is in my mind, I need an excuse. Like there needs to be something going on. I can't just do like a coffee table book of really cool places.
Yeah.
But I think if there was a market for that, I'd just do it.
That's awesome. And I mean, even though you didn't come to it, I guess, with a story in mind, I mean, it's got such a great story, and in all three books together, like they're tying in things in the background, things that are coming forward, and it all wraps up so well, even though you came from it. It sounds like just from a single illustration, which is really cool.
Yeah, and I would also say, like, in terms of the evolution of one's career and relationship to story, is that's how I started out, but now I'm doing books and working on projects that are very much driven by story and not the environment. And so I guess it's sort of, there's this idea in librarian world or literature of children being reluctant readers, like they aren't really into books as a kids, and how do we solve that problem? And I was a reluctant reader. I didn't want to read. To me, like, the only thing that was interesting to me about stories were the visuals, and I could get sucked in with film or with picture books, but not like a chapter book or something like that. And so I guess I only mention that because I think for all of us who have an impulse to create, it's really easy to judge yourself against the people around you and what they're doing and how they go about it. But we all have different ways of getting into the things that are going to move us and therefore move the audience of our work.
Yeah, that's real cool. Well, a couple questions to wrap up that I'd love to ask everybody we have on. And I think you've already hinted at it a little bit, but did you have any books that inspired you when you were a kid? And then you said you have one child? Or?
Yeah, we have another one coming, and one is in first grade.
Oh, well, congratulations.
Thank you.
And do your kids have any favorite books that they just love to read?
Interesting. So for me, as a kid, I was into certainly into Where the Wild Things Are, and the stuff that Mercer Mayer did, who was a contemporary who kind of copied Mercer Mayer's style, but actually did it quite well. And he did some really fantastic books. Some of them were wordless. And then when I was out of college, I found a Chris Van Allsburg book called Wreck of the Zephyr, which was about this flying boat. And it just like hit me. I was like, ooh, I want to do this. And that was the first thing that dropped into my lap where I was like, oh, I want to make picture books. Yeah. And I was probably like 22 at the time. And so and then my first job in film was working on a Chris Van Allsburg book. I was just like, could not.
Yeah. The Polar Express. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah. As far as like my daughter, she's all over the map. And it's interesting being an artist with a kid, is that you have these ideas of what you want your kid to be into. Like one of my favorite illustrators is Isabelle Arsenault, who's a Canadian illustrator. And I got this book of hers and I was showing it to my daughter and she was like, oh, this is so boring. Like she wants to read Fancy Nancy, you know?
Yeah,
The book about the missing puppy and all, like. So you just have to surround your kids with the stuff you love, and by the time they're 18, that's what they'll like. You know?
Yeah, that's good. That's real good. And then another one. So you mentioned that you've started doing books that aren't just your own stories, and so I imagine you're working with some pretty fun people. But do you have a dream person that if you were to collaborate on a project with, who that'd be, whether as another illustrator or an author?
Oh wow. I would like to collaborate in film.
Okay.
Yeah, I would love to collaborate in film. I love the moving picture, and on the book side, I'm already working with I just sent some stuff out to some people that I really would love to work with, and I don't know if they're gonna. So I better not say their names. On the podcast.
Yeah, that they're over there. Who in film would you want to work with?
Oh my God. I think anybody who's doing interesting work right now. I mean, there's so many fantastic. It is like film is like our modern. It's the modern art form of the day. Like it's where our current royalty spends their money. You know, like it's not kings and queens having their portraits done. It's like the masses going to see these films, and so much energy and talent goes into making them. So we're working on trying to get Journey into that space.
That's cool. Yeah.
And if that happens, that sort of collaboration would be really fun to work on.
That's real cool. Well, if folks want to keep up with you, and it sounds like you got lots of fun projects coming down the pipe, what's the best place for people to do that?
Well, they can find me on Facebook, and I have a Journey Trilogy name there, I think. And Twitter is @storybreathing, and my website is storybreathing.com.
Sounds good. Well, we had a blast chatting with you, and the books are amazing, and I look forward to having kids of my own in the future, so I can show them to them. So it'll be fun to read through. Well, good
Excellent.
stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you so. Yeah, I had a great time.